The coffee in the thin plastic cup had gone cold long ago, yet Irina still wrapped her fingers around it, drawing the last traces of warmth into her stiff hands. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and damp autumn air that slipped through the cracked window frame. Somewhere above, the ceiling pipes hummed quietly, and beside the bed, the monitor answered with a slow, patient rhythm. Beep. Pause. Beep. She watched the man lying beneath the pale hospital sheets. Ruslan. For a moment the name felt unreal, like a word from a forgotten language. 9 years had passed since the last time she had seen him, standing in the doorway of their tiny rented apartment, stuffing shirts into a travel bag while she tried to explain why her voice trembled and why her hands would not stop shaking. He had not listened then. The keys had clinked onto the nightstand, and the door had closed with a final, ordinary click that had somehow sounded louder than any thunder. Now he lay motionless, except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Outside the window, grey clouds gathered over Chernivtsi, thick and low, promising the kind of cold autumn rain that soaked through coats and settled deep into bones. Bare branches scraped softly against the old hospital wall as the wind pushed them back and forth like tired metronomes. Irina set the cup on the windowsill. She stepped closer to the bed. Ruslan looked older than she had imagined he would. The confident curve of his mouth, the one that had once charmed half the university, was now slack with exhaustion. Fine wrinkles cut deeply around his eyes, and strands of grey threaded through his dark hair. The man who used to talk endlessly about distant cities and bright futures now breathed with the fragile caution of someone balanced on the edge of a cliff. 2 hours earlier, the ambulance had rushed him here after a massive heart attack. When the paramedics rolled the stretcher into the emergency room, Irina had frozen for half a second. Chernivtsi was not a large city, but in nearly a decade their paths had never crossed. She had convinced herself he had long ago left, perhaps for Kiev, perhaps abroad, chasing the larger life he had always believed waited somewhere beyond this quiet place. The door creaked open behind her. A nurse leaned in, holding a folder against her chest. "Irina Viktorievna," Oksana whispered carefully, "the patient's relatives are here. His wife is asking for the doctor." Wife. The word settled heavily in the air. Irina did not turn away from the drip chamber where the transparent drops slid steadily through the tube. "Let her wait in the corridor," she said calmly. "His pressure is stabilizing, but the condition is still fragile. Watch the monitor. If anything drops, even slightly, call me immediately." Oksana nodded and disappeared. For several seconds, Irina remained standing beside the bed. Inside her chest, 2 forces pulled in opposite directions. One was the cold precision of a physician who had sworn to save every life placed in her hands. The other was a deep burning ache that had slept quietly for 9 years and had just opened its eyes. Ruslan stirred faintly in his sleep. Irina adjusted the blanket over his shoulder, then turned toward the door. Duty first. Everything else could wait. The corridor outside the ward smelled of disinfectant and wet coats. The old linoleum floor reflected the cold light of fluorescent lamps, and somewhere at the far end, a trolley squeaked slowly as a nurse pushed it toward another room. A woman stood near the wall, tapping the heel of an expensive shoe against the floor in quick, irritated beats. She was tall and elegant, wrapped in a cream-colored wool coat that looked far too refined for a hospital corridor. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, despite the wind outside, and in one hand she clutched the phone whose screen glowed impatiently. When Irina approached, the woman lifted her chin. "You're the doctor?" she asked sharply. "Yes." "I'm Alina, Ruslan's wife." The word wife sounded almost like a complaint. "What exactly is going on? No one explains anything here. They just tell me to wait." Her perfume was sweet and heavy, clashing strangely with the sterile hospital air. "He had a severe heart attack," Irina replied evenly. "The heart muscle is weakened. He needs complete rest and careful treatment." Alina frowned as if someone had just cancelled the dinner reservation. "How long will this take? We have a flight tomorrow morning, a vacation. Everything is already booked." For a brief moment, Irina thought she had misheard. "Your husband nearly died 2 hours ago," she said quietly. "There will be no flights." The woman sighed dramatically and rubbed her temple. "This is unbelievable. Thousands of dollars wasted." She muttered the last words more to herself than to the doctor. He always does this, ruins things at the worst possible moment. Irina felt a faint tightening in her chest, but kept her voice calm. "He was lucky the ambulance arrived when it did. His condition is critical." Yes, I understand." Alina waved a dismissive hand. "Can I see him?" "He's asleep. The medication will keep him under for several hours." The woman hesitated, clearly calculating something in her mind. "Fine. I'll come later," she said finally, already unlocking her phone. "Tell him I was here." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked down the corridor, her heels clicking briskly until the sound faded near the elevators. Irina watched her leave. So this was the woman he had chosen. A strange mixture of bitterness and pity stirred inside her. Not jealousy, no, that had burned away years ago, but something quieter, colder. The realization that the life he had chased so confidently had perhaps not led where he once imagined. She returned to the ward. Ruslan still slept, the monitor marking each fragile heartbeat with its soft mechanical voice. Outside, the sky had darkened further, and the first thin drops of rain tapped gently against the glass. Irina pulled the chair closer to the bed and opened the medical chart, forcing her thoughts back into orderly lines. Blood pressure, medication dosage, cardiac rhythm. Numbers were easier than memories. But even while she wrote, her mind drifted unwillingly through time, to a damp evening many years ago, when she and Ruslan had slipped through a hole in the fence of the abandoned botanical garden. They had climbed the broken wooden steps of an old greenhouse and sat beneath the cracked glass roof while rain drummed softly overhead. He had spoken endlessly that night about dreams, business, travel, the world waiting beyond the small streets of Chernivtsi. She had believed every word. The monitor beside the bed beeped steadily. Irina closed the chart. Outside, the autumn rain finally began to fall. By the time her shift ended, evening had already wrapped the city in damp grey light. Irina changed out of her white coat, folded it carefully, and pulled on her jeans and a warm sweater. The hospital corridors were quieter now, echoing with distant footsteps and the soft hum of machines continuing their endless work. Outside, the air was sharp with cold. Rain drizzled steadily, turning the asphalt into dark mirrors that reflected the yellow glow of street lamps. Irina stepped onto a crowded marshrutka, squeezing between tired office workers and students clutching backpacks. The vehicle jerked forward, crawling slowly through the traffic of central Chernivtsi. She leaned her forehead against the fogged window. The city moved around her in blurred lights and shadows, shop signs glowing, people hurrying under umbrellas, the smell of wet pavement rising through the cracked bus door. Ordinary life, familiar and distant at the same time. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the hospital room, to Ruslan. She remembered their first real date so clearly it almost hurt. It had not been a fancy restaurant or a trendy cafe like her classmates preferred. Instead, Ruslan had led her through the narrow streets behind the university to the abandoned greenhouses of the botanical garden. They had slipped through a broken section of fence and climbed onto an old wooden staircase covered in moss. Rain had tapped against the cracked glass roof above them, soft and rhythmic. He had spoken about the future as if it were something he could simply reach out and take. His own business, travel across Europe, a life bigger than the quiet streets of their small city. She had listened, a naive medical student with cold hands tucked into her sleeves, believing every promise. The marshrutka braked suddenly. "Last stop!" the driver shouted. Irina stepped out near a dim grocery store and bought bread, milk, and a few apples. Simple things for a simple evening. The building where she lived stood 4 blocks away, an old grey apartment block with chipped paint and narrow stairwells that smelled faintly of dust and boiled cabbage. She climbed to the 4th floor and unlocked the door. Before she could step inside, a small whirlwind of dark air rushed toward her. "Mama!" 8-year-old Maxim wrapped his arms around her waist so tightly she almost dropped the grocery bag. "You're home! I finished my homework, even the math!" Irina smiled for the first time that day and stroked his messy hair. "You're my clever boy." The apartment was small but warm. A kettle hummed softly in the kitchen, and the faint smell of yesterday's borscht lingered in the air. They sat together at the narrow table, while Maxim talked enthusiastically about school, about a classmate who had traded stickers with him, about a math problem he had finally solved. His eyes shone with excitement, dark and bright like melted chocolate. Eyes that reminded her painfully of someone else. As he ate, Irina watched him quietly. There it was again, the familiar shape of the eyebrows, the same stubborn crease that appeared when he concentrated. Ruslan's features reflected in a child who had never known his father. Later that night, the apartment grew silent. Maxim slept in the next room, breathing softly, while Irina lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Rain tapped gently against the window, and the memory of the hospital monitor's steady beeping echoed in her mind. Part of her wanted to walk into Ruslan's room tomorrow and tell him everything. To watch his face change when he learned the truth, that the life he had run from 9 years ago had not disappeared. That somewhere in this city his son was growing up. But she also remembered the fragile rhythm of his failing heart on the monitor screen. One shock, one emotional storm, and it might stop forever. Irina closed her eyes, listening to the quiet breathing of her child. Some truths, she realized, could be as dangerous as any disease. Morning arrived with the familiar smell of disinfectant and fresh coffee drifting through the hospital corridors. The rain had stopped, but the sky above Chernivtsi remained dull and heavy, as if the city itself had not fully woken yet. Irina tied her hair into a tight ponytail, slipped on her white coat, and began the routine she knew by heart. Checking charts, speaking briefly with nurses, scanning monitors that blinked with the quiet language of numbers and lines. When she reached Ruslan's room, she paused for a moment before opening the door. He was awake. The grey morning light fell across his face, making the sharp lines of exhaustion even more visible. He was staring at the ceiling as if counting invisible cracks in the paint. When he heard the door, he slowly turned his head. For a few seconds, he simply looked at her. Confusion appeared first in his eyes, then recognition spread across his face like a slow ripple. "Ira," he whispered. His voice was dry and weak, lacked the rustle of paper. "Good morning, Ruslan," she replied calmly, stepping closer to the bed and lifting the chart. "I'm your doctor. How do you feel today? Any pressure in the chest?" He blinked several times, still staring at her as if afraid she might disappear. "You work here?" he asked. "Yes." He tried to push himself up on his elbows, but immediately winced. "Don't move," she said firmly. "Your heart is still very unstable." She placed the stethoscope against his chest. Beneath the thin hospital gown, his heartbeat sounded uneven, heavy, tired, struggling through its rhythm. Ruslan watched her carefully. "You haven't changed," he murmured. 9 years, and you look exactly the same." Irina ignored the comment and finished writing notes in the chart. "You were lucky," she said. 30 more minutes without treatment and the damage would have been irreversible. He exhaled slowly. "My wife was here yesterday, wasn't she?" "Yes." A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. "Alina probably complained about the vacation." "She seemed concerned about it." Ruslan turned his head toward the window where pale clouds drifted above the rooftops. "That sounds like her." Silence settled between them. For a moment, Irina considered leaving, but his voice stopped her. "Ira, wait." She paused near the door without turning. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for how everything ended back then. I was young, stupid. I thought I understood life." The words floated in the sterile air like fragile glass. Irina finally looked back at him. The confident man she once knew was gone. In his place lay someone pale, exhausted, attached to wires and tubes that kept his heart beating. "Your mistakes are in the past," she said evenly. "Right now, your only task is to recover." He lowered his gaze. "You always were stronger than me." Before she could answer, the door opened slightly and Nurse Oksana stepped in. "Excuse me, Irina Viktorievna," she said quietly. "His wife has returned." Ruslan sighed faintly. "Of course she has." Irina closed the chart and walked toward the corridor. Alina was waiting again, standing by the wall with visible impatience. This time she carried a small sports bag and looked even more irritated than yesterday. "I brought his things," she said briskly. "Clothes, toothbrush, all that. Can I go in?" "He needs calm," Irina replied. "No arguments, no stress." Alina rolled her eyes. "I'm not the dramatic one here, doctor." She pushed past and disappeared into the room. Irina remained outside. Through the half-closed door she could hear fragments of their conversation, sharp, impatient words from Alina, quieter replies from Ruslan. Something about cancelled reservations, lost money, ruined plans. Irina leaned lightly against the wall, listening despite herself. It struck her then with sudden clarity. The man lying in that room had chased success for years, yet the life he built around himself seemed strangely empty. And for the first time since seeing him again, she felt something unexpected. Not anger, not even sadness, just a quiet question lingering in her mind. What had those 9 years truly given him? The voices inside the room grew louder. "I brought your things," Alina said sharply. The zipper of the bag scraped across the table. "And I spoke with the travel agency. If we get a medical certificate, they'll return 30% of the cost. So you should ask your doctor to prepare it." Ruslan's reply came slowly, like someone pushing words through thick water. "Alina, I nearly died yesterday." "And?" she snapped. "What do you want me to do about it? Sit here all day holding your hand?" A short silence followed. "I planned that trip for 6 months," she continued, her voice rising. "Everything is always about your problems, your business, your stress. For once, I wanted something simple." "It's hard for me to even talk," Ruslan muttered. "Yes, of course. Everything is hard for you when real life happens." Irina stepped back from the door. The conversation scraped painfully against old memories she had tried to bury. She walked slowly down the corridor, pretending to study a patient chart, until the argument inside the room faded into silence. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of routine: blood tests, consultations, paperwork. But again and again her thoughts returned to the quiet room at the end of the hallway. That evening she stayed late. When she finally passed Ruslan's room again, the corridor was almost empty. The lights were dimmer now, casting long shadows across the worn floor. The door to his room was slightly open. Ruslan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His face looked even paler than before, and a thin layer of sweat glistened on his forehead. "Are you in pain?" Irina asked, stepping inside. He shook his head weakly. "Just tired." She adjusted the drip rate, checking the clear liquid sliding through the tube. "Your wife left?" she asked without looking at him. "Yes." Another quiet pause. "She's not always like that," he said suddenly, staring at the plastic tubing beside him. "We just drifted apart over time." "That's not my concern," Irina replied, her tone professional. "I know." His voice cracked slightly. "I just wanted to say something to someone." Irina stopped adjusting the drip. Ruslan turned his head toward her. "When I felt that pain yesterday, when I couldn't breathe, I thought I was dying. And the strangest thing came into my head." "What?" she asked quietly. "That my life is empty." He gave a bitter half smile. "I have money, a big apartment, a car, but lying there on the floor, I realized that if I died, no one would truly miss me." The heart monitor beeped softly beside him. "Alina would worry about documents and accounts. My friends would come to the funeral, drink a few glasses, then return to their lives." His voice dropped to a whisper. "We never had children. She didn't want them. I kept saying there was still time." The words struck Irina like a sudden electric shock. Children. For a moment she could not breathe. In her mind she saw Maxim's face at the kitchen table, his dark eyes shining with excitement while he talked about school. Ruslan's eyes, Ruslan's smile, Ruslan's stubborn crease between the brows. The truth rushed to her throat like a storm. "You do have a child," she wanted to say. "A son who loves drawing cars and eating borscht. A boy who asks every night why his father never came home." She looked at Ruslan. His pulse on the monitor was climbing, the green line jumping nervously across the screen. His heart was barely holding together. If she said it now, the shock alone might destroy him. Irina closed her eyes for a second and swallowed the words. "You need rest," she said quietly. Ruslan watched her carefully, as if sensing something hidden behind her calm voice. But she had already stepped toward the door. Behind her, the monitor continued its fragile rhythm. Beep, pause, beep, and the truth remained locked inside her chest. 3 days passed in a strange, fragile calm. Ruslan's condition slowly improved. The grey color faded from his face. His breathing became steadier, and the monitors no longer screamed with every small movement of his heart. Still, the doctor spoke cautiously. His heart muscle was badly damaged, like an engine that had run too long without oil. Irina limited her visits to the strict necessities of treatment. When she entered the room, she spoke only about medication, pressure, pulse. Ruslan tried several times to begin real conversations, but her answers remained short and professional. It was easier that way. Outside the hospital, life continued with its ordinary rhythm. Irina woke early, prepared breakfast for Maxim, checked his homework, walked into school when her shift allowed it. The small apartment filled with the warm smells of soup, tea, and laundry drying near the radiator. For years it had been just the two of them, and she had learned to protect that quiet world like something fragile made of glass. One evening, however, everything shifted. Irina had just finished her shift and was walking through the corridor when her phone rang. Her mother's name appeared on the screen. "Ira, sweetheart," her mother said anxiously. "Maxim fell at the playground. He hit his head on the curb. There's blood. Not too much, but the cut looks deep." Irina's stomach tightened instantly. "I'm coming, don't worry." 20 minutes later, she rushed into the apartment. Maxim sat on the sofa, holding a towel against his forehead, his eyes red from crying. "Mama, I'm here," she whispered, kneeling beside him. The cut was not dangerous, but it needed stitches. Instead of taking him somewhere unfamiliar, she decided to return to the hospital where she worked. Within half an hour, they were walking through the quiet evening corridors. Most of the lights were dimmed now. Only the nurse's station glowed softly at the end of the hall. The surgeon on duty quickly stitched the small wound while Maxim bravely squeezed his mother's fingers. When it was finished, the nurses rewarded him with a large chocolate bar. He smiled proudly. "See? Not scary at all," Irina told him. "Can we go home now?" "Just a minute. I need to grab my bag." They walked down the familiar corridor together. Then suddenly a door opened. Ruslan stood in the doorway of his room, holding the frame with one hand. He had probably tried to walk to the bathroom or call a nurse. His hospital gown hung loosely on his thin shoulders. For a moment, no one moved. Ruslan looked at Irina first. Then his gaze shifted downward, to the boy standing beside her. Maxim stared back curiously at the pale man in hospital clothes. The silence became heavy, almost physical. Ruslan's eyes slowly widened. He studied the boy's face, the dark, messy hair, the familiar shape of the eyes, the stubborn line of the mouth. Something inside his expression changed. Understanding. He looked back at Irina. "Ira," he whispered hoarsely. "Who is—" But the question never finished. His hand flew to his chest. The color drained instantly from his face. "Mama, that man looks sick," Maxim murmured nervously. Ruslan tried to take a step forward, but his legs failed. He collapsed against the wall and slid down to the floor, gasping desperately for air. "Ruslan!" Irina shouted. The doctor in her took over instantly. "Oksana, call resuscitation, now!" Nurses rushed from nearby rooms. A stretcher appeared. Monitors were connected. The corridor exploded into urgent movement. But for 1 second, just one, Ruslan's terrified eyes locked onto Irina's again. And she knew. He had understood. Even without words, he had recognized his own son. They wheeled him quickly toward intensive care. Irina ran beside the stretcher, giving orders, forcing her voice to remain calm while inside her heart pounded like a hammer. Behind them, a nurse gently led Maxim away from the scene. The doors of the intensive care unit slammed shut. For 40 endless minutes, machines beeped, doctors shouted commands, and electricity surged through the fragile body on the table. Finally, the rhythm returned, weak but alive. When it was over, Irina leaned against the cold wall outside the unit, her hands trembling for the first time that night. Across the corridor, Maxim sat quietly with a nurse, still holding his chocolate bar. "Mom," he asked softly when she approached, "is that man going to die?" Irina knelt in front of him and pulled him into her arms. "No," she whispered. "We helped him." But deep inside she understood something else. The past she had hidden for 9 years had finally stepped into the light. And from this moment forward, none of their lives could ever return to the way they were before.